Zat Hashem, we're continuing on today in Masechet Sanhedrin with Daled Amud Aleph. We're beginning at the top of the page, Amar R Yitzchak bar Yosef. We're going to have two sections in today's learning. Really, it's a continuum of the previous sugya to understand the machlokes Rebbi and the Rabanan. If you need 3 or 5 judges when it comes to monetary cases, we already gave one reason, refuted that, gave a second reason. So the first section today will be R Yitzchak bar Yosef really supporting the second answer that we said, and he'll show like opinions in 5 places. And then we'll have as the second section of the day Acha bar Yaakov refuting that and then giving an alternative explanation of Rebbi and the Rabanan, which will lead us into tomorrow to understand these 5 Tannaim, how they would side based on this new understanding. So let's just remember where we're holding before we go ahead. We had a machloket Rebbi and the Rabanan. Sorry, before we continue, I want to mention also, we're learning as refuah shlema for Yaakov ben Dina. Be'ezat Hashem, our learning should be as a zechut for him. He should have a refuah very quickly and speedily in our days. Now, we had a machloket Rebbi and the Rabanan, which was, do you need 3 people to judge monetary cases, or do you need 5? The Rabanan said you need 3. Rebbi said you need 5. And that's a chidush to say 5. We've always been saying you only need a court of 3. So the Gemara attempted to understand, where does Rebbi get his opinion from? So the first answer we said, again, this is the bottom of Gimel Amud Bet, we assumed must be he holds that when we deduce the number 3 from Elohim 3 times, or 2 times adding another one because it can't be even, it doesn't mean the number you start off the court case with, but rather it means the number in the end who have to paskin in a certain direction as the majority in order to follow that psak. But the Gemara said that's obviously not logical, because we find by the 23-person court and 71-person courts that that's not the case. So rather we said a second understanding of Rebbi, and this is where we left off with yesterday. We said really the machloket Rebbi and the Rabanan is contingent on a shas machloket, a general debate throughout shas, which is, do we say yesh l'mikra or yesh l'mesoret? So what did that mean? He said like this. Pasuk tells us 3 times Elohim. That's true. The first one we're not going to expound, because you don't expound in Dorshin Chilot as we explained. So we have the second one and the third one. Now, the second and third time it's in one pasuk, but the third time it appears, pasuk tells us Asher Yarshi'un Elohim. Now, Yarshi'un, Elohim is to be understood as we're explaining now. Elohim is to be understood plural too. Why is it understood plural? Because the word Yarshi'un is also plural. So if the verb is plural, Elohim has to be plural as well, which means 2. If the third time Elohim appears, it means 2 judges. So the second time also it'll mean 2 judges. You can't have an equal court of 4, so therefore it has to be, add 1 more for 5. This is Rebbi following the position of yesh l'mikra, is that we read it, the word Elohim, even though there's no vav, Yarshi'un is to be read, Yarshi'un as a plural language, they shall incriminate, they shall say he's guilty, even though it's written without a vav, we expound the verse how it is read, not the way it's written. But the rabbis, the Rabanan, disagree. The Rabanan hold yesh l'mesoret. Yesh l'mesoret means we give primacy, or the way we understand the drashot in the Torah is the way it's written, not the way we necessarily read it. And since it's written, Yarshi'an, there's no vav there. Yarshi'un, there's no vav actually between the ayin and the nun, so it could be understood Yarshi'an, which is singular. So the Elohim there is singular. The Elohim previous is singular, which means you have 2. Can't have an equal court, so therefore you have 3. This is where we left off, that the machloket Rebbi and the Rabanan is contingent on this general shas machloket throughout the Talmud, throughout shas, which is, do we expound verses based on the mesoret, which is the Rabbanan's position, not the way it's read, but the way it's actually written. In this context, Yarshi'an would then be singular. Or do we expound the psukim, yesh l'mikra, the way it's read, which is Rebbi, he holds it's read Yarshi'un, therefore it's plural. Elohim is therefore plural. So you have a total of 4, because Elohim plus Elohim would be plural at 4, and then you would add 1 more 5 because it would have to be an odd man in the court. Fine. This is where we left off yesterday. The second understanding we have now so far of this debate, Rebbi and the Rabanan. Now, R Yitzchak bar Yosef, we're about to continue with, is actually going to support this understanding and show us 5 Tannaim in total, Rebbi being one of them, who seem to hold of this position of yesh l'mikra, there is primacy when it comes to drasha to follow the way a pasuk is read, not the way a pasuk is written. So let's see. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef. Now we have to remember these because we're going to have to tie back into these when this ultimately is refuted. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef says the following. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Rebbi, 1. Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz, 2. Ubeit Shammai, 3. Rabbi Shimon, 4. Rabbi Akiva, 5. All of these Tannaim, Kulu Sfira Lahu, all of them hold yesh lemikra. That if we have a pasuk that could be darshan, could be expounded based on the way it's written, which is the Mesoret, or based on the way it's read, which is the Mikra, we'll expound it based on the way it's read. So now what Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef is going to do is to go through each of these and show us from Mishnayot and Braitaot where we find these 5 Tanaim hold yesh lemikra. So first one is easy because we already did it. Rebbi hadamaran. So Rebbi, we've already said. Rebbi says, we paskind, that our shi'un Elohim, our shi'un is plural since it's read plural, and therefore Elohim is plural, it's 2. We compare Elohim to Elohim, so that's 4, and then you add one more so that it's not an even number, and therefore you have a total of 5. So Rebbi, we've already shown, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef says, that he holds, you darshan the psukim, you expound the verses based on the mikra, the way it's read, not the way it's written. But now we continue on with the ones that we don't know about yet. Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz. What is the position of Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz that he clearly holds yesh lemikra? Before we see this inside, just a bit of a background. We know that the halacha is when a woman gives birth, she becomes tameh as a yoledet. She's tameh as a woman who recently gave birth, and there's a certain number of days that she's deemed tameh in the Torah. This isn't exactly applicable perfectly in today's day and age. It means the tumah is certainly applicable, but in terms of the numbers that we're about to share, it's not necessarily exactly applicable. But the Torah teaches nonetheless as follows. There is a time period following when a woman gives birth that her tum'ah, her dam, the blood that she continues to experience from the birth and on, is considered demei tum'ah. That the blood is considered tam'eh, meaning she's still tam'eh to be with her husband. There is an extended period beyond that, which is called demei tahara, blood of purity, literally. But it means is, after the time period of demei tum'ah, of the blood of tum'ah, she'll go to the mikvah, and then blood that she continues to see is not going to be something that makes her tameh to her husband. However, she's still prohibited to eat korbanot. In order to allow her to eat korbanot, at the end of this entire process, she'll have to again bring korbanot, etc., process at the end of the entirety of it, and then she'll be permitted in kodshim korbanot as well. Now, we know, as the psukim imply, that there's a distinction how long these 2 time periods are between if a woman has a daughter or if a woman has a son. So what do the psukim say? Psukim in Parashat Tazria. It says as follows. That first time period of demei tum'ah for having a daughter is 14 days. For having a son is only 7 days. After that, she goes to the mikveh and she is permitted to her husband. And then the extended period, which we call demei tahara, that the blood she sees doesn't necessarily contaminate her to her husband, for a daughter is 66 more days. For a son is 33 more days. Meaning for a son, it's much less. We're talking about these days of impurity and as also the blood of tahara. The end of this procedure, meaning after 7 plus 33, which means after 40 days for a boy, and after 14 plus 66, which means after 80 days for a girl, 14 plus 66, 80 for a girl, then she goes to the mikveh, brings korbanot, and she's considered permitted to consume korbanot. Now, the pasuk says, when it comes to having a daughter, it says shivu'ayim. Shivu'ayim means that her original days of tum'ah are 2 weeks. Shavua is a week, Shivu'ayim is plurality of weeks. She's Tme'ah for 2 weeks. But the word Shivu'ayim, if you take out the nikudot that we know to read it with, Shivu'ayim, you could actually read it as if it's Shiv'im, which means, we're going to see the students of Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz asked him, maybe her Tum'ah is not really for 14 days, for 2 weeks, but maybe it's actually for Shiv'im, for 70 days. If you hold yesh, meaning if you take it in the context that's actually written, not the way we know traditionally to read, maybe it means 70 days. So let's see. From this, we're going to deduce. Again, let's keep the train of thought that Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz ultimately is the one who holds, like Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef is saying, yesh lemikra. So let's see the Braita inside. Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz, the Tanya of a Braita that says as follows. Shalu Talmidim et Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz. The students asked Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz, Ekra'ani shiv'im. Maybe the way to read the verse that a woman is tameh after having a girl is 70, shiv'im, and not shvu'ayim. Yachol teheyoledet nekevat tme'ah shiv'im. So maybe if a woman gives birth to a girl, she should be tme'ah not for 2 weeks, but actually her initial stage of tumah should be for 70 days, much more. So Mar Lehen, initially Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz said, not a question. Why is it not a question? Because we have a comparison, or what's called a mematzinu, a comparison of similar ideas between having a boy and having a girl. What is that? Amar Lehen, he says like this, Timei v'tiher bezachar. We have the concept of the days of Tumah and Tahara by a boy, which is 7 and 33. V'timei v'tiher bin keva. And we have the same idea of those days of the blood of purity and impurity when it comes to having a daughter. Ma kishetiher bezachar. Just as the days of the blood of purity when it comes to a male, which is 33, bin keva kiflayim. When it comes to a daughter, we know it's double, it's 66. So this creates a precedent, is that the demei tahara of a girl is double the demei tahara of having a boy, a son. So it's 66 instead of 33, which is for a boy, a son. Similarly, based on mematzino, based on simple comparison, kishetimei bezachar, the days of impurity, of the blood of impurity, initial days of a male, which is 7, bin keva kiflayim. It's logical that for a female, for a daughter, should also be double. And thus we know shvu'ayim is the way to read the pasuk. It means 14 days, 2 weeks, not shiv'im, not 70 days. Now that's how Rabbi Yehuda bar Roetz initially answered their question. Ben Roetz initially answered their question. But la'achar sheyatzu, after they left, yatzau machzer acharem, went back to his students, and he wanted to amend what he said. He said, we don't need a mematzinu in order to a comparison of comparing the zachar and nekeva, the male and female, son and daughter, in order to deduce that it is to be read shvu'ayim. Mar Lehen said, iatem zkukim lekach. We don't need this. I mean, it's not necessary for us to deduce that it's 2 weeks and not 70 days based on this comparison, but rather shvu'ayim karinan. The way we read it is shvu'ayim, the yesh lemikra, and the way we darshim psukim is traditionally how it's read. So since it's traditionally read as shvu'ayim, that's what's the general way we read it. That's our tradition as to how the verse is meant to be read. We don't read it shiv'im, so clearly Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz holds yesh lemikra. Even though Masoret, you look at it, it could be shiv'im. Nonetheless, since the way we have traditionally to read it is shvu'ayim, it's also 14 days, as that is the way yesh lemikra. So we've shown so far that Rebbi and Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz hold that the way to read this verse is the way to darshim psukim, expound verses, is yesh lemikra. Continues the Gemara. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef continues and says, how do we know Bet Shammai, the third of these Tannaim, also holds yesh lemikra? Okay, so just a brief background before we see this inside. This is a Mishnah in Pesachim, which we're going to have to understand in a minute. The halacha is as follows. We know when a person brings a korban, one of the important steps in the sacrifice of the korban is rikat adam, is sprinkling the blood of that korban. Actually, the atonement that a person receives is achieved when he sprinkles the blood. That's considered the kapara, when he achieves atonement, when he sprinkles the blood on the mizbeach. Now, the mizbeach hachitzon, the outer mizbeach, which is where they sprinkle the blood generally, had a chut hasikra, which was a red line that surrounded it, separating the top half of the mizbeach from the bottom half of the mizbeach. This red line determined the distinction between the upper and lower parts of the mizbeach, which was important because certain korbanot, the blood was sprinkled on the top half of the mizbeach, and certain korbanot, the blood was sprinkled on the lower half of the mizbeach. Now, in order to understand this next Mishnah, as we'll show, let's just give a quick brief background about how that works. Most korbanot, olah, shlamim, asham, the blood was sprinkled on the lower half of the mizbeach, number one, and two, there were 2 applications of the blood that were made, which was what the Gemara calls shtayim shehen arba. 2 applications, which was like 4. But what does that mean? It means that there were these corners on the four, or horns, as if, but it means corners on all the corners of the Mizbeach. So they would apply 2 applications of blood to the corners, but to 2 different corners. And by doing so, it would hit the 4 sides, 2 applications which turned into 4 because it was applied to the corner, and it would spread. So it was 2 applications that ended up being 4. So again, most korbanot, which is Olah, Shlamim, Asham, the blood was applied on the lower half of the Mizbeach, under the Chut HaSikra, this red line, and there were 2 applications which ended up being like 4 placements of blood because it would spread on the corner to the 2 sides that it would hit. Regarding a chatat, it was different in both accounts. The korban chatat the blood was applied above the Chut HaSikra, and there were 4 applications made altogether. 4 applications initially were made in order to be yotzeh. Now this is all lechatchila. What we're going to show in this Mishnah is, what about b'diavad? Let's say a person diminished the amount of applications that he's meant to do when it comes to sprinkling the blood. So how would you still be yotzeh if you diminish less than what it's supposed to be lechatchila? So let's see. Beit Shammai, and from this we're going to deduce that Beit Shammai holds yesh l'mikra. How does it work? The Mishnah Masechet Pesachim says as follows. Beit Shammai Omrim, Beit Shammai says, Kol nitanin al mizbeach hachitzon. Any korbanot that are meant to be sprinkled on the outer mizbeach, which again, let's refer to the category that are sprinkled below the Chut HaSikra, Olah, Shlamim, Asham, etc. Kol nitanin al mizbeach hachitzon shenatnan b'matana achat. If instead of sprinkling 2 applications, like we said, they're meant to be done, he only sprinkled 1 application. So the halacha is kiper. It is effective still. He has still achieved an atonement. And this is the position of Beit Shammai. So if instead of sprinkling 2 sprinklings, he sprinkled 1 time, for this first category that are meant to be on the lower part of the Mizbeach, and he was supposed to do lechatchila 2 sprinklings, he only did 1, kiper, he still receives an atonement. Some take out this Girsa, Rashi has it, Shene'emar, V'dam zevachecha yishafech. As it says in the Pasuk, the blood of your sacrifices you shall pour. It implies 1 motion. So even 1 time, 1 sprinkling would be sufficient, b'diavad, but it would be sufficient for this first type of korbanot. Uvechatat, however, if it's the chatat, which lachatchila requires 4 applications on the Mizbeach, shtei matanot. So says Beit Shammai, if you did 2, again, it's not lechatchila, but if you did 2 applications of the blood on the Mizbeach, you'd be yotzeh b'diavad. So what comes out is, according to Beit Shammai, if you apply for the korbanot, which is the first category of korbanot that require 2 applications, if you did just 1 application, yotzeh b'diavad. If you're regarding the chatat, which requires 4 applications, so if you did 2 applications, also yotzeh b'diavad. Less than that, you wouldn't be though. Beit Hillel argue. They say, Af bechatat shenatnan b'matana achat. Even with a chatat, if you only did 1 application, again, lechatchila requires 4. But b'diavad, even if you only did 1, kiper. So the Mishnah Pesachim finishes off there. It still acts as an atonement, and it's effective b'diavad. That's the machloket. Amar Rav Huna, and Rav Huna continues and explains, my time at the Beit Shammai. Why does Beit Shammai say that in regards to this chatat, you need at least 2 applications b'diavad of the blood, otherwise you wouldn't be yotzeh? Because the psukim there in regards to korban chatat say the word karnot 3 times. Karnot means the corners. So it says it 3 times. It says karnot, karnot, karnot. Now as we're going to see, it's not written malay with the vav each of those 3 times. But Beit Shammai hold yesh l'mikra, that we expound the psukim as they are read, and therefore, since they're expounded as they're read, karnot is plural. So therefore it would mean, karnot, karnot, karnot means you apply it to 6 corners, because 2 plus 2 plus 2 is 6. Hare kan shesh, that would imply 6. Now there's not 6 corners in the Mizbeach, there's only 4. So why does it teach 6 according to Beit Shammai? Arba mitzvah. It means 4 is to be yotzeh lechatchila. In order to be yotzeh lechatchila, when it comes to the chatat, you should apply to the 4 corners. However, the other 2 that are being referenced in the pasuk, the shtayim la'akev. The other 2 are to tell us that b'diavad, as long as you did 2, the last word, karnot, is to tell us you would be still yotzeh b'diavad, even though you weren't yotzeh lechatchila. So that's why it writes karnot 6 times. 4 times lechatchila, 2 times at least, you would be yotzeh if you applied to 2 times on the Mizbeach for the chatat, you'd be yotzeh b'diavad. That's the position of Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel omri, but Beit Hillel say, seemingly they hold yesh em l'mesoret. We expound the verses as they're written, not as they're read, and therefore, if you look at these psukim that are written regarding the corners of the mizbeach, it says karnot. The first one's plural, but the other two are karnat. They're written in the singular format. They're read karnot, practically, but it's written without a vav. So therefore, you have to expound it as if it's karnat, which is singular. So it's 2 + 1 + 1. Hare kan arba. That means you only have a total of 4. So Beit Hillel say as follows: Gimel mitzvah. 3 of them are there to teach us that ideally you should have the 3 more in addition to the first one. Lechatchila for the chatat, you should do 4 applications on the corners to be yotzei. But ve'achat la'akev, one of them is to teach us that as long as you did the first one, you're yotzei b'diavad, and that's why even if you did 1 sprinkling of the blood on the mizbeach, only 1 application for the chatat, you'd still be yotzei b'diavad. Now the Gemara asks an obvious question on Beit Hillel. Wait a second. According to Beit Shammai, I understand they hold yesh em l'mikras. You have 6 words of corners to expound. There's not 6 corners, so there's 2 extra to teach you. B'diavad, you're yotzei if you sprinkle on two times in the mizbeach for a chatat. But according to you, Beit Hillel, you need all 4 because you hold yesh em l'mesoret to teach us bichlal that you need a lechatchila, put it on all 4. So maybe b'diavad you don't even need to put it on 1 to be yotzei, because there's nothing extra here in terms of saying that 1 application would be necessary even b'diavad. Ve'ema kul l'mitzvah. Maybe all of these verses, according to you, Beit Hillel, that you're saying yesh em l'mesoret, they're all there simply to teach us lechatchila you need to put it on all 4. But b'diavad you don't even need to put it on 1 in order to be yotzei. Maybe that should be the pshat according to you. There's nothing extra for drush. So the Gemara answers, that's still illogical. Why is that illogical? You might not derive it from the verses, but b'diavad it has to be at least on 1 application for the chatat, because kapara bichdi lo eshkachen. We know that the sprinkling of the blood is how you achieve the kapara, you achieve atonement. And it's illogical to say you achieve atonement without performing even 1 application. So simply by logic, it has to be 1 application is necessary in order to achieve at least this level of atonement. Otherwise, you wouldn't be even yotzei b'diavad, your kapara. But the bottom line is, what we see from here is, Beit Shammai hold that the psukim are expounded in the plural form, because that's the way they're read. So says R Yitzchak bar Yosef, this is the 3rd Tana we find who holds yesh em l'mikra. We expound psukim based on the way they're read, not the way they're written. Let's move on to the 4th now. Rabbi Shimon. This is a discussion in Masechet Sukkah. Now, before we see this inside, let's understand outside. Rabbi Shimon is discussing a halacha that has to do with the walls of a sukkah. We know, we build a sukkah in Sukkot, there are certain laws that guide us in terms of having the hechsher sukkah. What is the basic requirement to have a kosher sukkah? So, there's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, which means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu on Sinai, he gave over the Torah shebichtav, what was written, the written Torah, which is Tanakh, or Torah, and Torah sheba'al peh, Mishnayot and Gemara. But there were also some things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu whispered to Moshe on the side that Moshe was supposed to pass down from generation to generation, and this became known as Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Halacha to Moshe from Sinai. So there's certain things the Torah might write something clearly, but this special, unique halacha as given to Moshe on Sinai, it's like HaKadosh Baruch Hu whispered in the back to Moshe, tell the future generations this as well, even when that might not actually work directly with the psukim in the Torah. So we'll see. The halacha l'Moshe Sinai we're going to talk about in Sukkah is that the last wall of Sukkah, in order for a Sukkah to be kosher, doesn't have to be a full 7 amot like a proper wall, but it could even be 1 tefach. Or 7 tefachim, It could be 1 tefach. It could be even 1 tefach. You don't have to have a full wall. It could just be 1 tefach, and that's sufficient. However, there is a machloket, as we're about to see, how many walls are required for a sukkah, and however many walls are going to be required for sukkah will apply that halacha l'Moshe Sinai to say the last one could be a tefach, which means the last of the count that we're about to show could be a tefach, and the sukkah would still be kosher. So let's see that inside. Rabbi Shimon de Tanya, as the Braita illustrates, Shtayim kilchatan v'shlishit afilu tefach. So the Tannaim in the Braita says, Masechet Sukkah, that 2 of the walls of a sukkah have to be full-sized walls, And the third, afilu tefach, could be even a tefach. So you could have two walls, and the third could even be a tefach. In Masechet Sukkah, the Gemara discusses where does that tefach have to be placed. But it doesn't have to be a full third wall. It could be even the size of a tefach, a hand's breadth, which is a very small amount. Rabbi Shimon argues, he says a little more. He says, Shlosha kil chatan, you need three proper walls, v'revi'it afilu tefach, and the fourth wall would be sufficient, even a tefach. What is the basis of machloket between the Tanakama and the Rabanan and Rabbi Shimon? Rabanan savri, the Rabanan hold, yesh lemisoret. We expound the verses as they are read, as they're written traditionally, not as they're read. Rabbi Shimon savar yesh lemikra, and Rabbi Shimon holds that we expound the verses as they're read, not as they're written. Rabanan savar yesh lemisoret. The Rabanan say you expound the verses as they are written, and therefore, if you look in the Torah, it uses the word Sukkot 3 times. And from this we deduce the number of walls in a sukkah. However, if you look, 2 of them are written without a vav and 1 is written with a vav. So therefore it would be read as follows. Basukat, basukat, basukot. 1 plus 1 plus 2 is 4. Harekan arba. That gives us a total of 4 walls that would be required to have a kosher sukkah. Dal chad kra legufei. An important point here. You don't expound the first one like we learned earlier, because we said earlier, ein dorshin tchilot. Whenever the first word appears in a context, you don't utilize it for number. So therefore, pashu lehu tlat, you're left with a total of 3. So this halacha Moshe Misinai tells us that if you have 3, the third one is diminished. It doesn't have to be a full third wall, but it could just be a tefach. And thus the Rabanan say you could have 2 walls plus a tefach. That's a sufficient measurement for sukkah. Rabbi Shimon argues because he holds yesh lemikra, and therefore he expounds all 3 verses as basukot, basukot, basukot. 2 plus 2 plus 2, harekan shesh, which is 6. Dal chad kra legufei. Now again, remove one of those verses, which removes actually 2 walls for the beginning, the fact that it's the introductory verse. You can't use that for a drasha. Pashulahu arba. So you're left with 4. And now that you remove 1 you deduce 1, you diminish 1 because of the halacha Moshe Misinai that says the 4th one doesn't actually have to be a full wall, but it could just be a tefach. Therefore, you're left with 3 walls plus a tefach, and that's sufficient for a sukkah to be kosher. But the bottom line is, we've shown also in the position of Rabbi Shimon that we darshan the words plurally because they're read that way. Thus, he holds the 4th opinion, yesh lemikra. So far, so good. So we have 4 opinions so far. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef said, all hold that we expound the verses as they're read, not as they're written. Now the 5th and final one is Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, in the Breita, is going to discuss halacha of tum'ah. We know when it comes to tum'ah, which is spiritual contamination, tum'ah is not something physical. It's not that a person becomes dirty, but there's a certain spiritual element that a person could become defiled or tameh. Now, specifically, when it comes to contact with the dead, there's what's called tumat met. There's 3 ways a person could become tameh met: if he touches a dead body, carries a dead body, or he's in ohela met. Ohela met means in an enclosure along with a dead body. These halachot are extensive and complicated. We're just going to focus in on what's necessary for today. Regarding ohela met, the tent of a dead body or a cover with a dead body, if a person's in some sort of a canopy or coverage with a dead body, he could contract tum'ah from that. And that's where there's a body. But what if there's other parts of a body? So the halacha is, and everybody agrees, the blood of a dead person can also convey tumah in a ohel, in a contained area. A revi'it of blood, which is a quarter lug of blood, that can convey tumah to another person if they're in the same contained area as a revi'it of blood of a dead body. Now that's where it's of one dead body. But we have a machloket Tannaim. What if you have that amount, a revi'it of blood, and it's a combination of 2 different dead bodies' blood? Is that sufficient to convey tumah to the person who's in the same enclosure as that revi'it of blood? So the Gemara says as follows. The Breita says, Rabbi Akiva Tanya, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Minayin l'revi'it dam sheyatz'a mishnei meitim. If a revi'it of blood emerged from two different bodies. How do we know Shemitane be'ohel? It also has the capacity to convey Tumah, says Rabbi Akiva, in the ohel, in the contained area. Shene'emar, like the pasuk says, Hakol nafshot meit lo yavo. It says, on all, this time at a Kohen actually, but all of the nafshot, which is plural, the souls of a dead body, lo yavo, the Kohen cannot pass over, cannot come in contact with. So says Rabbi Akiva, what does it show? Nafshot is plural. Shtei nefashot, it means if you have two bodies that produced blood, vishiur achat, and it's only one measure that would generally contaminate, i.e. it's a revi'it, it's the smaller measure of a revi'it from two different bodies, nonetheless, it will still convey tum'ah to the people who are in the same tent as it, or the same enclosed area as that dead body, as that blood. For Rabanan, but the Rabanan say, oh wait a second, it doesn't say nafshot with a vav. It's actually written as if it's nafshat, which is singular. Nafshat ktiv, and the pasuk says nafshat, so it's singular, and therefore it's only if it's a revi'it of blood from one dead body, not if it's a revi'it of blood from two dead bodies. So the bottom line, you see, Rabbi Akiva expounds the verse as a plurality because it's read that way, even though it's written without a vav. So you see, says Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef, that these five opinions, including Rebbi, the four more plus Rebbi, four Tannaim plus Rebbi, all seem to hold. We expound verses based on the way they're written, not the way that they are, based on the way they're read, not the way that they are written. Now, Rabanan, good. Now, what the Gemara is about to do in the second section of the day is Rav Acha bar Yaakov is going to pull the rug out of this entire attempt to explain the position of Rebbi as it relates to this machloket about 3 and 5 judges. The problem that Rav Acha bar Yaakov is going to show is that clearly everyone holds we expound verses as yesh l'mikra, as they're read and not written. Why? Because as we're about to show very clearly, there is a very famous drasha that says lo tifashel gedi b'chalev imo, that you're not allowed to eat a gedi, is a kid, but it means meat, b'chalev imo, in its mother's milk. This is the source in the Torah. You're not allowed to eat meat and milk together. Cook, eat, etc. Now, if you don't hold yesh l'mikra, so the word chalev, which means milk, could also be read as chelev. Chelev is fat. So if you don't hold yesh l'mikra and you don't expound it as it's read, but you expound it as it's written, so then perhaps there's a prohibition to cook meat with fat and not with milk. There's no issue with that. But then where would we know that there's a prohibition of cooking meat and milk? So the Gemara says, obviously, it must be everybody agrees, yesh l'mikra. But if that's the case, you can't explain that's the machloket Rebbi and the Rabanan, because then the Rabanan wouldn't have any basis of saying 3 people is necessary for a monetary court. So therefore, Rav Acha bar Yaakov is going to conclude actually is everyone holds yesh l'mikra. We have to explain these debates differently. So Matkif Rav Acha bar Yaakov, last line of Dal Amud Aleph, Rav Acha bar Yaakov asked a strong question against this whole approach of Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, and really the second explanation of Rebbi. Mi ika delet le yesh l'mikra. Is there any opinion who doesn't agree with yesh l'mikra, that you expound verses as they're read? But we know Va'atanya, the Braita teaches, b'chalev imo, we expound you can't cook meat in milk of its mother, in milk. Yachol b'chelev. So maybe it means you can't cook it in fat. But then, where would we know that you're not allowed to cook meat and milk together? Turning to Dalet Amud Bet, Amrit yesh l'mikra. So the answer to that is obviously yesh l'mikra, is that verses are to be expounded as they're read, not as they're written, and therefore says Rav Acha bar Yaakov, it must be the Rabanan agree to that as well. But then you can't tell me the approach that you were saying until now, that these arguments are based on if you hold yesh l'mikra or misoret, because clearly everyone agrees to yesh l'mikra. So now what Rav Acha bar Yaakov is going to have to do is to explain a third pshat in Rebbi, the machloket Rebbi and the Rabanan, and now he's going to have to go through all of these machloktim that Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef was quoting, which is 4 more, in order to understand how they argue if it can't be based on a simple machloket of yesh l'mikra and yesh l'misoret. Now we're just going to start it. We'll continue on with the second one tomorrow. But the Gemara says al dekuli yami yesh l'mikra. So Rav Acha bar Yaakov says rather everybody holds yesh l'mikra. The Rebbi v'Rabanan ba'akim miflagi. So how do we understand then the machloket Rebbi and the Rabanan? So the machloket is like this. Again, let's remember, the pasuk tells us Elohim 3 times. You can't expound the first one, so you really have the second and the third one to deal with. Now initially we thought Yarshi'an, it's either Yarshi'an, which is misoret, or Yarshi'un, which is plural, and therefore Elohim would be 2 or 1, depending on how you expound in Mikra or Masoret. But we're saying, no, everybody holds Yeshem LeMikra. So what's the machloket now? The Rebbi v'Rabanan b'hakim iflagi. Rebbi savar, Rebbi holds Yarshi'un Elohim Acharini. Yarshi'un Elohim is, like we said before, which is as follows. The end of the second verse, where it says Elohim again, it says, they, the judges, shall incriminate. Now Yarshi'un is plural. So therefore, since it's plural, and the Rabanan are going to have to agree to this, we'll see in a moment how they darshan. Yarshi'un is plural, and therefore it tells us the noun associated Elohim is also plural, but Acharini, it means this Elohim is other two. Meaning to say is, you have the first Elohim that appears in the verse, which is deduced from the second Elohim that appears in the verse. The second one is 2, based on the verb Yarshi'un, and therefore the first one is also 2. It's talking about 2 different groups, so 2 plus 2 equals 4. You can't have an even court, merely you need to have 5, exactly like we understood Rebbi before. But what about the Rabanan? For Rabanan, how do they understand that it's only 2 and then a third is because it can't be even? So the Gemara answers, Rabanan Savri, the rabbis held, Yarshi'un, it's true. Yarshi'un is plural, and therefore it's saying Yarshi'un Elohim. When it says Yarshi'un Elohim, it means you need 2 judges. That's true. Let me just explain this outside. But what the Rabanan understand is as follows. You do need 2 in the end, but what it's saying is, with the first one, the first Elohim that's listed, which is 1, plus the second time it says Elohim, that's 2. In total, you're going to have 2, but it doesn't mean 2 different groups of 2 that makes 4, but rather 1 Elohim plus another Elohim, that's going to be Yarshi'un, a plurality. Now you have 2, because 1 plus 1 is 2. You can't have 2 because it can't be even, and male you have to have 3. Let's read that inside. Rabanan Sabri and the Rabanan hold Yarshi'un, when it says they shall incriminate, it is a plurality. What does it mean? Deha'ech, of that one. Meaning the Yarshi'un tells us you need 2 judges. What does it mean? Of that one. V'hai, and this one, the first Elohim plus the second Elohim, that actually creates a plurality, but it doesn't mean 4, it just means 2 in the verses. And now that it can't be an even number, now it would have to be 3, and that's why the rabbis say you need 3 in order to adjudicate monetary cases. Now we're going to stop here at the top of Dalet Amud Bet, but tomorrow we're going to have to continue on in this new Mahalach of Rav Acha bar Yaakov to understand the Machloket, understand the other 4 debates that we quoted, that the other Tannaim seem to hold Yeshem L'Masoret, now that we're saying actually everyone agrees Yeshem L'Mikra. We'll pick up tomorrow at Dalet Amud Bet. Everyone have a wonderful day.